It's gonna be all right. Ooh, boy. Morning, this is a test. It's still on. It's not working. Now, how's the volume? Not good. Yes, the mic is on. Mic is on.
Turn it up.
Good morning.
I think that's good.
Good morning.
It says the speaker's off on the screen. Does that mean anything?
That's in the back. They're figuring that out.
All right. Can you hear me if I speak like this in the back?
Yeah.
Colgate, can you hear me?
Better turn the feed.
Here we go. We're getting a little bit of feedback.
As soon as you get an echo there.
Starting to get an echo. I'm gonna wait for Becky to give me the high sign.
All right, try again.
I'm on mic now. It's on.
It's on.
Are you hearing it?
I hear you just.
Okay.
Just start, Gard, because Carla can hear you regardless. So.
All
Who's
right.
that? Carla?
Yeah, it's Carla.
Hey, Carla.
She can't see you guys.
All right. So,
Go ahead.
thank you. Good morning. So we are at the Freiburg New Church Assembly. This is August 1st, the Monday of the first week, where our theme is the second coming: who, what, where, when, why, and how. The title of my talk is Swedenborg's Treatment of the Second Coming, a Deeply Structured Reading. And I'm Gard. Thank you all for being here. Susanna started us off on the porch this morning with a be here now, and with a wonderful invitation to realize that we are here, which is a wonderful achievement and kind of a miracle if we look at it that in a general way. So I want to just take this moment to become present with you and you with each other in your space here at the lecture hall for the first week's lecture. It's such a privilege and an honor. So the description of our week theme is as follows. Emanuel Swedenborg makes several remarkable claims that bear on our first week's theme. He reports that he witnessed a reordering of the heavens during his lifetime, 1770. He tells us that the human mind can come into the form of a newly reordered heaven, that human societies in this world can also come into the form of heaven, and that these changes in the spiritual world initiated the Lord's second coming, which is now well underway. Our first week's lecturers will speak to this process and its significance for our lives today. For this morning's talk, I will present a few words about regeneration, a brief overview of all 5 eras, for we're in the 5th era of the Lord's advent into the world, and we'll conclude with a word about a difficult requirement that is given to us in this era of the Lord's second coming. I'll get to this requirement at the end of the talk, but I begin with a few words about regeneration. For the purpose of the Lord's advent in the world at any of the stages, and particularly at the beginning, the first one, which we'll hear about in just a moment, is so that human beings can be regenerated. The Lord's advent in the world in all of the eras is to create the conditions in which human beings can become receptive to divinity and deepen their lives grow in their ability to be united with the Lord, live according to the Lord's providence, and see as angels see, which the most ancient church people did. So with that basic idea that regeneration underlies all of the eras, I'll start with these words from early in the Arcana, where Swedenborg is commenting on the creation story, and he writes, quote, "From the sense of the letter."
Sorry, where's the book coming to?
Yeah, we're getting a little
Because you're
feedback.
standing on it, bud.
Oh, see.
You're literally standing on it, my friend. That is why we can't hear you. So let's put this in the proper location.
All right, so that,
And
okay, great.
how
All
about
right.
now?
Okay, this is not a drill.
I love you, Gard.
I love you even more now, Becky. I never thought I could. Commenting then on the literal sense of the creation story, Swedenborg writes, "From the sense of the letter, only the subject matter people can recognize would be the creation of the world, the Garden of Eden, which is called paradise, Adam, the first human being. Who can think anything different? The fact is that these things," he writes, "contain hidden treasures of pure love." Commenting on verse 1, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The most ancient time is called the beginning, we find. The beginning involves the first period when human beings are being regenerated. For we are then born anew, receive life. Regeneration is therefore called the new creation. The expressions in the Bible, to create, to form, to make, in almost all parts signify to regenerate. Each era has its beginning and an end. The beginning is when the conditions for regeneration of human beings exist. The end of an era is when they no longer exist. The existence of the human race becomes threatened. Today we are in the fifth era. Swedenborg calls it the last judgment, which is that of the Lord's second coming. Let's look briefly first at the first four preceding eras. And we begin with the most ancient church, in which all human beings on the face of the earth, we are told, were able to love the neighbor and to trust the divine. And there was perception of the Lord's providence in their lives. And Swedenborg writes, "Experience has shown me that in the earliest times, which was called a golden age, language consisted in speaking and in writing in ways in which no attention was paid to the literal meaning of the literal meaning of a word or the surface presentation of an image of another person, other than to enable wisdom to shine through. For their knowledge was primarily a knowledge of correspondences, a form of knowledge at the present day, that would be Swedenborg's day, which has been lost." Now here I'd like to say just a few words about what I understand about the most ancient people. This was a collective race, this was humanity as we conceive of this as a spiritual era in which a childlike nature existed for their whole lives. When they looked at trees, mountains, and rivers, they thought of love. They thought of their thoughts of divinity. When they looked at the sun, they felt divine love within them. They felt the Lord's providence. It was all one. It was innocent. It was direct perception and knowing of their union with their Creator. Very much like a 5-year-old would be able to feel, or a 3-year-old, but not be able to say. That era existed until, and this would be the end of that era, when their will, with no other ability other than to will their experience, failed them, somehow became corrupt, and there were giants in the land. This became a form of self-love. This was the flood, and now we get into the second era, the era in which humanity in a spiritual way was destroyed itself, shall we say, but our loving, good Lord provided another mechanism, and this was the flood, after which was the rainbow, and the ark, and the animals, and the few who could survive. And that was the era in which the understanding or the intellect was separated from the will. And he calls that the spiritual church. And yes, we are still in that era. We're called a spiritual church for the simple reason that our intellect and our will can be separate. The intellect can rise and then bring the will with it. And that is signified by the ancient church. That would be Noah. As you know, in the story, there were several generations in the book of Genesis after the children of one father and mother after another. And we come to the era of of Jacob, basically. It's called the children of Jacob. Begins with Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the progenitors of the people of Israel. And this begins what's called the Israelite church. That's the third era. Something very interesting happens at this point. And this is distinctly developmental. For humanity, if you will, had evolved to the point where they lived not as simple children the way the ancients must have lived, but now they are in families, clans, tribes, and eventually a nation. This is all the Israelite church. And they developed the customs that one would associate with culture. They had ritual worship, they had religious practices, they had laws, they had geographic territories, they had boundaries, they had treaties, they made peace, and they made war. And this, in a word, is a human drama. And the term representative church, by the way, which is the term that Swedenborg uses, actually, I could argue, could refer to a dramatic representation of the relation of God and humans. It's a drama. And if you read the book of Genesis and on into the books of history, it's dramatic. There are ups and downs, there are losses, there are betrayals, there are promises, promises given, promises broken. That's a drama. And that, Swedenborg tells us, allowed for the relation between divinity and humanity to exist in symbolic form. Now, Swedenborg famously tells us that this is a people living in, quote, externals only. And this cannot be stressed enough to understand I believe what Swedenborg is trying to tell us. There were no internals. They did not exist. Not in any one single human being. That will change. Not in any one people. Now, of course, the people of whom we're speaking are the people of Israel. And that's a major religion in the Western world, and we call that a God of history. Simply means that there's a historical record with events that have been recorded, not as literal history in the way we think of historians today, but as the story of the formation of a people, a particular people, a people of God. And their story is particularly the religious practices of, and we'll get to that, of sacrifice and holiness and purity. These were the picture of external worship. I do not say that in any pejorative form. Externals matter, and they they were the only mechanism, if we read Swedenborg in this way, by which divinity could maintain contact with humanity through their ritual action, which we now have recorded in the Bible. Okay, now we come into the era when the Lord was born. So we're up to 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the fourth era. If you're reading in the translated writing, it's the primitive church. Primitive, again, not in a pejorative sense. Simple, direct, real, transformative, because it was based, there's two dimensions to this. One on a gospel of love to the neighbor. It can't be stressed enough. This is the first time, I'm simply reporting what I read in Swedenborg, so I'm not trying to say anything beyond that. We can make up our own minds. This is the first time in human history when history was more than violent. We can't even imagine how violent this tiny geographic region in the ancient Near East was under the. It's just incredible. I can imagine it, and you can, but they're under the heel of the Roman army. And their institutions had become corrupt just to survive, so the Jewish institutions had become corrupt. The only thing that was keeping the people together was their sacrifice at the temple. It just ordered their yearly lives, ordered their daily lives, ordered their lives every minute. There are things you could do on certain times of a day. This is all in externals, of course, until a human being is born. We know of as the Lord while he lived in the world. Jesus of Nazareth, the historical Jesus, was born, came into the world, grew up, and in my way of reading, became a young rabbi. He was a thoroughly educated and trained in the rituals of what would have been Galilean Judaism. He would have known Jerusalem, but only at a distance. He would have been there only several times a year growing up. And what Swedenborg tells us is momentous beyond saying. But to try to put it into words, he's the first human being born in the Western world whose internal was open. And this is in the context of a world, and I'm limiting this, I now limit this to the Western world. What goes on in the Asian world is actually quite different. And I'm happy with that. I'm approaching that with humility. This is enough for us to realize that in the Western world, there was a single human being whose internal mind was open. It was open to God himself. God's self was his internal being. The divinity itself. So now we have divinity joining with humanity through one person. That's it. Nobody else. Everyone else is still in externals. And in this fourth era, we have the development in Swedenborg's writings of his development of his mind and his actions and his ministry, so that he becomes a full human being and able to convey that to others. And those are the first disciples, those are the first followers, those are the people that came to Jerusalem for what we now call Palm Sunday, but it was the Passover. And there were thousands of people. This was why he could not be tolerated. It was not because of his teaching. The rabbis and the Pharisees couldn't dispute what he said. It was the people that were clogging up the streets, and Rome was becoming upset. So that's why he was executed. I'm sorry to say this, but his teaching was very benign. Love to the neighbor. And it was transformative because he taught that to survive in this world, and I meant the world in which Rome was the occupying force, their own religious leaders had, by reason of necessity, co-opted their religious practices in order to survive within the Roman Empire. And life was not a precious thing. People died horribly all the time. He told his disciples, this is how you will live. Love one another as I am teaching you how I love you, right? And this formed a small band, a small group, an enclave. And they were living a new kind of life, transformative. Their internals were beginning to open. So this is the characteristic of the fourth era. And it becomes, as we now know from history, somewhat from Acts, the book of Acts, but elsewhere, the congregation. Now, by the way, this was a thoroughly informed example of a deepened internal Judaism. They were in Jerusalem. They read the Torah the same way they always did. They practiced not all of their ritual practices because the Lord said these are now transformed, and of course there was other things that happened with John the Baptist that simplified their views of Judaism, but nonetheless they were grounded in, steeped in, and remained a movement within Judaism in Jerusalem. That's what some people call the Jerusalem church. Now, this is a slight diversion, and I won't spend time on this, but there is another church that formed just after this, with less than 100 years, actually less than 50, and we all know that this would be the Church of Rome, because Saul of Tarsus became Paul the Apostle, and his ministry was to what they call the Gentiles, the Greek-speaking world, not in Israel, not in Jerusalem, Asia Minor, Greece, Thrace, and Italy, Rome, and their ministry was basically very different from what Jesus had taught, his ethic, the way he taught, and what developed in Jerusalem. And I think Swedenborgians, I will speak here as a feeling, are much closer to the church in Jerusalem than we are to the church in Rome. And after all, the evidence of this is Swedenborg did not take Paul's letters. He thought they're good. It's good theology. It's good ethics. It's good teaching. It does not have an internal sense. And we're dealing with correspondences in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Gospels. It's a special kind of language. And at this point it was the so-called primitive church, the fourth era of which we're speaking in this week, that made this possible to bring correspondences to life. That's what Jesus did. He fulfilled them. And what are correspondences? They're simply, in this context, they're the ability to see, hear, perceive the physical world around us, them, I'm going to say them, the physical world around them. This is what Jesus taught. He used all these images and metaphors from nature. He taught them to see the images of nature that we see here in Freiburg, to see their relation of love to one another as corresponding to their interior relationship to divinity. So what was on the outside matched what was on the inside, and they were one. Okay, and we have hymns like that. We know they will know that we are Christians because of our love. Okay, that was true in the so-called primitive church. Now Swedenborg, of course, I'm going to have to move on from that. because now we have quite a bit of history, again, in Europe, in the Western world, where by the time Swedenborg was alive in the 18th century, he basically witnessed two things: institutional corruption and hypocrisy. I mean, this is an oversimplification. Governments worked fairly well. They were monarchies. We would look back on those times and say, that's not okay. But that's not what we're doing right now. We're looking at what the time was in which Swedenborg lived. And he saw the institution of the clergy, particularly in the Catholic Church, but, well, you know, all kinds of problems when we do this, but we do this very respectfully. And with the Reformed Church, he said, no. And he would say that the era ended of the spiritual era of the fourth era, began the fifth era in which we're now living, is when internals needed to be restored again, right? So Swedenborg makes the remarkable claim, and we all know that his spiritual eyes were open. He had been given access to the spiritual world 25 years before he claimed in 1770 to witness the reordering of the heavens and the initiation of the Lord's new church. Okay, for 25 years he had been given access with his spiritual eyes open to see what life in heaven was like, to see what life in hell was like, to see what life on earth was like. And he realized that he had work to do as a servant of the Lord. He was given the task which he was capable of doing. And this is because of his training as an enlightened scientist and eventually theologian. He could just go right back to the beginning and look and see what's there and realize that the scriptures had been written under the providence of the divinity in such a way that they themselves were in correspondence with the internals, first of all, of himself. He had to be the first one. Okay, there were no Lutheran ministers in the next door neighborhood who were able to do what Swedenborg did, and he realized over the course, this is what, by the way, our dear Reverend Dr. George Dole spent the last 5 years of his life doing, was reading the material Swedenborg had written just before his enlightenment. Took or just after his enlightenment and just before he began the Arcana, Secrets of Heaven, which is his tour de force, which is mature, which demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that Swedenborg is telling us that the text as written in Hebrew and translated into all our different languages corresponds to the development of the internal person, interior levels of the mind. And this is the first time in history that had happened. So there's Swedenborg writing away and eventually gets to realize that it's just not about him. This is about the spiritual world and humanity, I'll say the Western world. Now has a new relationship with divinity, divine providence, the life of heaven, the life of charity as we read it, new possibilities, which and this is a severe claim, made possible by his writing. Without those books, we would not know this in a way of speaking. That's why they're valuable. And that's why we have a responsibility to interpret them in ways which actually accomplish that, which would be so that our inner lives are open and which we actually practice. So our interior lives, we've moved a long way now. Our interior lives can be opened in the way that Swedenborg describes in his work, so that our inner lives can be joined with heaven, and through heaven with the Lord, and through our outer lives be joined with the world, and through the world with other people and useful activity. And that the various distinct levels of our mind can become one. And that's going to bring us right back to the most ancient church, because that's what they were, with one big difference. They were like children, and I got bad news for us, we're like adults. Right? We have responsibility that children don't have. So I'm going to read something here. In this era of the new church, which is the Lord's second coming, which is our theme, we can return to a form of learning in earliest times, which was that golden age, which consisted in speaking and in writing, that enabled hidden wisdom to shine through. Their knowledge was primarily a knowledge of correspondences, which is a form of knowledge that at the present day, and that's Swedenborg's day, has been lost, and now listen to the difference. And today, Swedenborg writes, is being restored. So there's your quintessential statement about the significance, in a general way, about the Lord's second coming. It's through a knowledge of correspondences, which is a form of knowledge which had been lost in Swedenborg's day, and he is now restoring it. When all things in the Word are translucent from the Lord as the one and only source of everything written there, here also lies the reason why the inmost level meaning of the Word is about the Lord, His love, His providence, the kingdom of heaven, and especially the glorification of His human. And we read in the Gospel of John, "In that day ye shall know that ye are in me, and I in you. They that hath my commandments and do them are they that love me, and I will love them, and manifest myself to them. I will come unto them, and make my abode with them." Okay, so now I'm going to get back to that requirement I mentioned at the beginning, and I find it mentioned in the following of Swedenborg's understanding of a verse in the book of Revelation. It's a very common image. I'm sure you'll know it. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hear my voice and open the door, I will come into them and sup with them, and they with me." Swedenborg writes, where the door and knocking signifies the Lord's perpetual wish to unite with human beings and to communicate the blessedness of heaven. However, something is required, that we use the ability to think well about the neighbor and the Lord, for when we do, the door to the inner levels of the mind is opened. If we think ill, it is shut. The Lord, who is perpetually present with us, and by his perpetual presence, gives us this ability. Now, the requirement sounds easy enough, but there's more there than meets the eye. For in this new era of the Lord's second coming, something is possible that many might think is not possible. That the interior levels of the mind can be opened all the way to heaven now. That we can live simultaneously in a sacred world, that is heaven, and a secular world, that's the world out there, simultaneously. I therefore propose that we can indeed use our ability to think well of the neighbor and of the Lord, that the interior levels of the mind can be open all the way to heaven, that we can learn to live in a sacred world within and a secular world without, both at the same time. And while this may be difficult, there are teachings in this new era of the second coming that show us the way. These will be the subject of my second talk later in the week. For this morning's talk, then, We've heard a summary of the theme for this week of the Lord's second coming. We've heard that regeneration is at the basis of that, meaning the Lord's providence is such that there ought to always be the conditions so that human beings can be regenerated. We've heard a brief description of each of the 5 eras and that we're in the 5th now, and that we've been given unlike those of the most ancient church, we've been given responsibility. And what is it? To think well of the neighbor and of the Lord, so that our interior level of the mind can be open all the way to heaven, and we can live in a heaven on earth now. And so, with that, I will thank you for your kind attention. And I see a hand.
Thank you for all that history.
Welcome.
I've been spending a lot of time trying to merge what Swedenborg talks about with these 5 different eras with the story that's coming out of evolutionary understanding. For instance, 30,000 years ago, according to evolution, the Pleistocene era, all these people were getting together in Europe in small groups. And they didn't really need to communicate with words. They could do it with actions and stuff when they were small groups of less than 50. And they also, they did kill people, but they also lived together very well, and then they moved on to this era of larger groups, just like you're saying. And all I'm just saying is there's a lot of connection between what Swedenborg perceived in 1600s that is being sort of connected to the way people are going. And finally, the things that we learned early as a human species back 30,000 years ago, eat together, smile, groom each other, do that kind of stuff. We still do that now, you know? Thank you.
And your name is?
Dean.
All right.
Please state your name and then share your comments. And I'm Susanna with the microphone.
Somebody be brave. We need a little dialogue. Just what thoughts came to your mind? Pick one.
Hi, I'm Carol. I was listening from out there, and I was interested in what you said about the separation of the intellect and the will. Here? I was interested in what you said about the separation and the bringing together of the intellect and the will.
Right.
And I wondered if you could say a little more
Yes.
about that.
Sure. You know, this is something along the lines of what Dean said. I mean, the fact that human beings can do this is beyond confirmation. We try to teach this in elementary school to help people realize that their thoughts do not necessarily mean they have to act on them. This is the first basic meaning of it. And when humans, we can train animals to do that, but they don't do it naturally, and they can only do it in very, very limited ways. I'm not going to say anything about cats because that'll get me in big trouble. Swedenborg is famous in TCR, in True Christianity in the 500s. He talks about reformation and regeneration and repentance. Repentance is the ability to separate our thoughts about our lives from our lives. We can actually stand still and not move and reflect. And teaching, he calls doctrine, is teaching us how to live. And the basic ways that humans in the Western world can learn how to live is learn what's in the 10 Commandments. So things we do, things we don't do. And we need an intellect. I think Carol's question was probably rhetorical, but we need an intellect to be able to not act on everything we want to act on. So that would be to prevent something bad from happening. That's so no harm can happen to another person. That's only the first half of it, though. That's so you stay out of jail. basically. The second half is so that once the intellect is raised, and this is the entire basis of Swedenborg's teaching model, is that we can learn all the way up to what heaven is like, where angels are, and they're like living in perfect correspondence with their use, their love, their humanity. Angels are humans, and with under the Lord's providence, and it's just as if they were a cell in the human body. It's that close a fit. And so we can know that with our intellect. Then we look at our own lives and realize, whoops, I'm not quite there yet. We're not quite there yet. So what incremental steps, and that's another form of discernment, use of the intellect. What's the first step? What's the second? What's the third? What does it look like at the end? This is all intellect. And the will follows. And so Swedenborg says that the intellect can draw the will up to heaven. And I'll end with the warning, and the will can draw the intellect away from heaven. Okay. And self-will, selfishness, this is the kind of thing we generally talk about. All right, thank you, Carol, for that question. I'm going to pick on people here. If I'm looking at you, ask a question. Dave, thank you. This is a dialogue portion. I had 40 minutes. You people have 10. Come on.
You've mainly been talking about the intellect leading the will to heaven, but I would say the will has to come first. You have to repent first.
Okay.
Your will has to want heaven and to let the Lord into your life when the Lord is knocking. Once the will has decided, oh, I want to do God's will, I want to be good, or I want to do what's best for myself, and that's how I'm going to live my life, which people were free to choose either one, and people do choose either one. I think that comes first. Then we can use the intellect to help our will along.
Aha. Aha. A classic both and. I'll say, and I'll go like this. I'll say, Carol, I'm going to speak for, what I said to Carol is right. What Dave just said is right. How can they both be right? Swedenborg answers that question. So there's a phrase. This one is very common. Long-time Swedenborgians, and I'm looking at you, I know. I'm sorry. Okay, wait a minute. There's a phrase, and this addresses both and. Affection for truth. Affection is the will for what? For truth. That is the beginning of regeneration. That is the beginning of a human life. And what's true? Well, Swedenborg says, well, let's make it simple. Let's say the 10 Commandments are true. They're not only true, they're holy. And if you regard them as holy, you will have a precious will for the precious truth. And it's the both of them that operate like a motor, a spiritual motor. Okay? So thank you, Dave, for that. Very nicely done. Carol is back, and then I'm calling on you. If I'm staring at you, I'm going to make you ask a question.
I don't think I need a mic.
Okay, so Jesse, we only have 5 minutes left, by the way. Jesse's after.
Hopefully this is short. So if you have the will to go to heaven,
Right.
what if you want to go to heaven for the wrong reason? What if you want to go to heaven
Okay.
because you think it's a better place and you think you're better,
All right.
so then you want to go to heaven for the wrong reason?
So what's your answer to that question? Answer your own question.
Because then I think that you're taking God or the divine out of the equation.
That's right.
And so then you're not allowing the divine will to come through you.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. We've got this person asked the question and she answered it. Jesse's next, and then Roz. Oh, no, she didn't raise her hand.
Hi, it's Jessie. I'm just thinking about the most ancient church, or thinking about children and just
Okay.
and the will and the intellect and that innocence, and how maybe the intellect isn't getting in the way. You know, if you're innocent and you're not taking in all the, I don't know, I'm just thinking about that state of not being, I guess, corrupted by thoughts and things. You're just connecting with the divine almost emotionally, maybe. I don't know, just like, maybe you could say more about that.
Sure. Well, the notion of childhood development is classically considered today as a developmental question. So we know that physical stages of development, biological stages, psychological, learning models, we have all kinds of ways we understand that people learn, right? And what Jesse just said about childhood is something that we all know. I mean, they're innocent. They don't think because they can't. They haven't developed the cortex to be able to do that. Now, and that's what parents are for. We think for them. We're their memory. We're their conscience. That's what parents do. Now, a child will develop to the point where they can learn intellectually, aha, I can moderate my own behavior so mom doesn't have to, or dad doesn't have to do something. And now I'm independent. I'm autonomous. That's great. An ego. Thoughts are good. It's bad thoughts that are bad. That's what we got to think. That's what we got to learn about. It's not, intellect isn't bad. The misuse of intellect is bad, is a problem. So yes, Swedenborg is very clear. You know, I've got time for one more question after my little answer here, or my way of reading Swedenborg. He is the first in so many categories of thought and culture and life. It's amazing. He's the first to articulate a developmental psychology, but also a depth psychology. He introduced psychodynamics into the Western world, which is meaning of the existence of an unconscious. We have unconscious motivation. That's another reason why we have to develop the intellect. Why did I do that? I keep doing that. And we all experience things like that. All right, 3 minutes and counting. Roz, thank you for raising your hand. Jeez, it's amazing. I've talked to people on the porch, they talk back. Here, you give them a lecture, and they just sit there. I'm going to ask.
What was I doing exactly while I was listening?
Yeah, go ahead.
You said
You've got a
anyway.
question, right?
My question was, you referred several times to the inner levels or higher levels of the mind.
Interior level.
Interior levels. If you could just address the question of whether we ever become conscious of those functions, or whether that's another kind of consciousness in the higher levels.
Would you just, you know what, maybe, could you possibly take...
Oh, no, I couldn't. I don't
Okay,
want to
so go
spread
ahead and just ask that one more time and a little more simply, basically. Go
Oh,
ahead.
okay, a
Try
little more
again and I'll
simply.
answer it.
All right.
It's going to be a one-word answer.
Okay, the interior levels of the mind, is that something that we can become conscious of in the same way as we are conscious of our thoughts and emotions now?
Yes.
Thank you for the answer.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gard.
Yes.
And those who want to discuss more,
No, we're done.
hold it till 11.
Okay, yeah, at 11 o'clock we'll have a discussion here, thank you. After the second, this was just the first talk.